Hello and welcome to this webinar. It is the fourth in a series showcasing the benefits of substituting hazardous chemicals and the tools and resources that are available to help you. My name is Adam Elwan and I will be your moderator. Now, the substitution of substances of concern with safer alternatives is one of the key goals of the European chemicals legislation. Finding potential alternatives, assessing their hazard profile and their risk, as well as their technical performance and economic feasibility, is not an easy task. During our previous webinar in April 2018, we gave you an overview of the available tools and methodologies to support substitution. Today, we will focus on one of them, GreenScreen. GreenScreen is widely used in the United States to compare substances on multiple hazard endpoints and rank them according to different benchmarks. By providing easy-to-understand results, GreenScreen helps to make decisions and trade-offs easier when selecting chemical alternatives that all have different hazard profiles. Today, we will show you examples of how companies and authorities use GreenScreen to find safer alternatives to substances of concern. GreenScreen can help you to assess alternatives as part of your substitution activities or as input to a regulatory measure. EU authorities can also use it to support their work in regulating chemicals. Here's the agenda for today. First, we'll hear from Shari Franjovic from Clean Production Action. She introduces the methodology and assumptions underlying GreenScreen and how it actually works in practice. Then, Mr. Brian Pentilla from the Washington State Department of Ecology will tell us how a governmental agency uses the tool in their assessment of alternatives to substances of concern. A company perspective will then be given by Corey Robertson from Hewlett & Packard. Corey explains how his company has been using GreenScreen for several years to help them identify safer alternatives and explain the trade-offs they've made. Finally, Mr. Paul Ashford from Anthesis Group shares how he sees GreenScreen assessments complementing his day-to-day work for the REACH evaluation process. Now, you can submit questions to the Q&A panel in your webinar window. Today's presenters are here to reply throughout the webinar. Make sure you select the All Panelists option from the Q&A panel when submitting your questions. If you want to address the specific speakers, mention their name at the start of your question. They will answer in their own capacity and do not reflect our official position. You can submit your questions at any time until the end of the webinar. We'll answer as many as possible through the Q&A panel, so stay connected until you get a reply. If your question is not answered by the end of the webinar, you can send it to us using our contact form. The address should be visible on the screen. If you experience any technical difficulties, let us know through the Q&A panel. This webinar will be recorded and published on our website. A link to the recording and the presentations will be sent to you soon after the webinar. Now let's hear from our speakers. Shari, please go ahead.
Welcome, everybody. I'm going to kick us off with an introduction to GreenScreen for Safer Chemicals. Then we'll hear from a U.S. state regulatory agency about the use of GreenScreen, a manufacturer, and then we'll hear about GreenScreen from a European perspective. GreenScreen is a hazard assessment methodology, and it really focuses on answering the question, which of these chemicals has an overall lower hazard profile? And the approach that it really focuses on is reducing risk by reducing hazard first, which is a principle of green chemistry, and really understanding and avoiding the unintended consequences of exposure controls that can and do fail. GreenScreen has been integrated into a number of alternatives assessment guidelines and toolkits, including the OECD Substitution and Alternatives Assessment Toolkit, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences guidance, U.S. Department of Labor toolkit, and U.S. Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse Alternatives Assessment Guidance and Framework. The GreenScreen program has two key tools or metrics. The first is GreenScreen for Safer Chemicals, which is a comprehensive hazard assessment methodology. And the second one is GreenScreen List Translator, which is a rapid screening tool to identify known chemicals of concern. And I'm going to go through each of them in turn. Next slide. Next slide. GreenScreen, in terms of the value that it provides for users and what we hear about it, there's kind of a few key elements. The first is that it simplifies complex hazard information and is really designed for decision makers as well as to communicate in the supply chain and overall hazard profile of a chemical. It charts a path to a safer chemicals economy by allowing one to place chemicals along a continuum based on that overall hazard profile. And finally, builds confidence and collaboration in the supply chain by giving a common language and a common metric for information sharing and communication within the supply chain on hazard. The GreenScreen methodology was originally published in 2007, has gone through a number of revisions. The most recent version is version 1.4, which we published in January of 2018. And one of the key revisions with this version is that we added an additional section on evaluating polymers, acknowledging the uniqueness of that type of substance. So we had the first section on chemicals, second section on polymers, and the third section talks about how to report out products based on the information of each ingredient in the product. Next slide. GreenScreen, again, is a hazard assessment methodology, and it's designed to identify both chemicals of concern and safer alternatives. The methodology is completely freely and publicly available, transparent. You can download the entire methodology from the link at the bottom of this slide. It's scientifically robust and was developed in consultation and with the support of scientific experts from around the world, from organizations including companies and government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and academia. And we continue to have that support through the Science Advisory Committee and peer review groups for revisions to the methodology. It's comprehensive and developed by a nonprofit organization. This is the assessment process and the steps in the assessment process, and I'll walk through each one individually. The first step, obviously, is to identify what chemical you're going to assess, collect the data, classify the hazards, and then assign an overall score to the chemical that you're assessing. Next slide. Oh, and just briefly, while anyone can download the method and apply the method themselves, you can also hire a licensed toxicology firm to do the assessment for you. In terms of collecting data, we collect data on these 18 hazard endpoints, and I like to call this sort of a standard set of hazard endpoints that builds upon authoritative precedent. That includes regulatory precedent, such as US EPA New Chemicals Program and the European Union's REACH, classification and labeling systems, such as GHS and OSHA, and voluntary initiatives. And it does include some notable additions. We do call out endocrine activity as a separate hazard endpoint. We also split out systemic toxicity and neurotoxicity, and we do include physical hazards, really to emphasize worker health and safety. And I would say the other really foundational principle of GreenScreen is transparency. And so this idea of splitting endpoints out is really about demonstrating where there are data, where there are lack of data, and what you're making your decision based upon. Next slide. In terms of collecting data, actually, I'll say one more thing, which is that the data collection includes a comprehensive review of all available data and information. So this includes measured data, both in vivo and in vitro studies, human epidemiology studies. It also includes computer modeling, read across, et cetera, and professional judgment. So it's very comprehensive. The next step after you collect the data is to compare all the information you've collected to the GreenScreen hazard criteria. And there are two key elements. The first is for where you actually have data. And then we use we primarily base it on the GHS categories and guidance. So in this case of cancer carcinogenicity, you'll see how that lines out for the high, moderate, and low. The other piece of criteria we include are these list-based data sources. So the idea here being if a chemical has already been reviewed by an authoritative body with a comprehensive review, there's no reason to do that review again. And so what we've done is we've taken the time to really map out the classifications of these various authoritative bodies against the GreenScreen criteria and translate that such that if a chemical is on one of these lists, you can easily determine what that indicates in terms of the hazard level. Next slide. And the net result of this entire process is a GreenScreen hazard summary table. And I think that this is one of the key elements of the value of GreenScreen is having this visual image, a summary of a very comprehensive review. And it gives you an overall sense of the hazard profile of a chemical at a glance. And there's a lot of information in here. The hazard level, and if you click through 2 more times, the hazard level is indicated by the letter. And then there's also a level of confidence in that hazard classification. That's indicated. High confidence is in bold and low confidence is in italics. So you get a sense of, and then the other piece that makes it so easy to get a sense of visually is the color scheme. The other thing I want to mention is that, again, transparency is really key part of GreenScreen. And so you'll see that data gaps are very clearly differentiated from low hazard. So if there's insufficient information to classify a chemical for a specific hazard endpoint, that will be indicated with a white box and the letters DG. Next slide. The final step is to assign a score. And next slide. This gives you a sense of the overall hazard profile of a chemical. And I think this is one of the key value adds for GreenScreen from the perspective of designers and decision makers, as well as from the perspective of communication. It gives you a way to communicate in a simple way the overall hazard profile of that chemical and line them up and compare them. For example, if you're looking at chemicals with a similar function. But behind all that is the comprehensive evaluation, including a summary of all the different data and studies that went into the hazard classifications and then that hazard summary table as well. In terms of the benchmark criteria, these are they're a combination of hazard levels and hazard endpoints. Benchmark 1 was really selected to align with regulatory precedent for what's considered a chemical of very high concern. So this aligns well with the REACH substances of very high concern, as well as many other frameworks. The benchmark 4 is really low hazard across the board. And then benchmarks 2 and 3 were developed to create steps in between. And you'll also see on the right-hand side here, there is something called a benchmark U, unspecified due to insufficient data. So if a chemical really has almost all data gaps, rather than even placing it along the continuum, we do, again, differentiate between insufficient information and low hazard. Next slide. This is just a reiteration of what's captured under benchmark 1. Generally, it's CMRs, so those that are carcinogenic, mutagenic, or reproductive or developmental toxicants, PBTs, persistent and bioaccumulative and toxic, and then the various permutations on that theme, so very persistent and very bioaccumulative, etc., and then equivalent concerns such as endocrine disruptors. The elements that go into assigning a benchmark score, what I've talked about so far is considering the known hazards of the chemical. And that is the first step is you compare the hazard summary table to those criteria that we looked at the prior slide. However, the benchmarking process also has 2 other steps. The second step is to look at data availability and data gaps. And then the third piece is to look at environmental transformation products. And in both of these cases, the score can be downgraded, for example, due to lack of sufficient data. So for each benchmark from 2 to 4, there are data requirements. And if a chemical doesn't meet those data requirements, it gets downgraded to a lower benchmark score, and it carries a subscript to indicate, for example, DG for data gaps indicates that lack of sufficient data is what's driving that score. And in the case of transformation products, these are cases where a chemical transforms into something that's more persistent and more toxic than the parent chemical. Again, it would be indicated with a subscript TP for transformation products. Next slide. This is an example of how GreenScreen has been used in the context of evaluating alternatives. And this was it was a proof of concept for the California Safer Consumer Product Regulations, looking at methylene chloride in paint strippers. This is the hazard summary table for methylene chloride. Next slide. And the next step was to identify potential alternatives. And you'll see that the alternatives are lined out here, and you can see the high-level benchmark score of the alternatives. So if it has a higher number, then it's possible that that may be an overall safer alternative or a lower hazard profile. The next slide shows you that as you dig in deeper, one could really evaluate which hazard endpoints are of concern and look at alternatives from the perspective of how is this chemical going to be used, what are the exposure pathways that we're most concerned about, what parts of the life cycle, and then that can all be taken into consideration when selecting potential alternatives. Next slide. There are, I'll just mention briefly, there are what we call 3 types of GreenScreen assessments, and this really is indicating who did the assessment and how much oversight that Clean Production Action has on the quality and completeness of that assessment. At the bottom, you have what's called an unaccredited assessment. As I mentioned, this methodology is free, and you can download it from the website, and anyone can conduct an assessment. When they do that, Clean Production Action has 0 oversight. And so on the assessment report, you would see the assessment type as unaccredited. And it's largely unknown what the quality and completeness and bias may be. It really depends on the assessor themselves and their qualifications. The next level, back one slide. The next level is an authorized assessment. These are folks such as Corey Robertson, who's our next, or as a later speaker, and Brian actually have gone through a training program provided by Clean Production Action and demonstrated their ability to conduct a comprehensive GreenScreen assessment. And so they are then authorized to do that for their own organization. And finally, the certified assessments are conducted by licensed GreenScreen profilers, and these are toxicology firms that offer this service as a fee for clients and are considered the highest level of quality and oversight and really a third-party assessment. Next slide. In terms of obtaining GreenScreen assessments, you can do it yourself. If you want to find certified assessments, there are existing assessments. There are some that are freely and publicly available, and there are a number of databases where you can go to locate them. If you don't find one that's freely and publicly available, you can contact a licensed profiler. Many of them have databases of assessments that they've conducted that you can purchase for a reduced fee, or you can commission a new assessment of a chemical of interest to you. And there's also, Brian will be talking a little bit more about the chemical hazard assessment database that the Interstate Chemical Clearinghouse has, and they do include all different levels of GreenScreen assessments as well. Next slide. This is just one of the databases mentioned. This is the GreenScreen store, which is more like a library because it's all freely and publicly available GreenScreen assessments, and it's on the Clean Production Action website. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk about the second tool in the program, which is GreenScreen List Translator. Next slide. And List Translator is a screening tool designed to quickly identify chemicals of high concern. It was originally developed as a portion of the full GreenScreen assessment, excuse me, and later users started to tell us, hey, this is a really valuable standalone tool as a high-level screening. And it's built off of the criteria in the full methodology. Next slide. So the process of doing an assessment with GreenScreen List Translator is identical in terms of the steps to a GreenScreen assessment. However, the data hazard, classifying hazards and assigning score can and has been automated by software partners. The other thing I'll say is in terms of collecting data, it's only list-based data sources that are included in this case. In terms of assigning a score, it's only the benchmark 1 criteria. Next slide. So we're looking for absence or presence of chemicals on specific authoritative lists, comparing that and translating that against the hazard endpoints and hazard criteria, and then the GreenScreen benchmark 1 criteria, resulting in a list translator score. Next slide. And really the list translator is asking the question of whether this chemical is a known chemical of high concern based on screening these list-based data sources against the GreenScreen benchmark 1 criteria. The scores that are possible are LT1, which is yes, it is. LTP1, it's possibly chemical of concern. LT unknown, and there's one more, no GSLT. And these basically are, you're not sure if it is a chemical of concern or not, but it's not based on these authoritative body listings. So what you can do with GreenScreen List Translator is identify known chemicals of high concern. What you can't do is identify safer alternatives. But these are the GreenScreen specified lists that it's screened against. There are 42 lists, and they're lists published by authoritative scientific bodies. There are nonprofit organizations like the World Health Organization, published lists, and some of them are screening lists as well by other advocacy organizations. So you'll see some examples of different organizations that publish these lists. Next slide. The tool has been automated, as I mentioned, by 2 partners, Healthy Building Network and Toxnot, and these are the tool names, Toxnot, Pharos, and Data Commons, and there are links to that at the end of this presentation. This is just a screenshot to show you that when you type your chemical abstract service number, CAS number in, it pops out with a score. If you look on the bottom, it says GreenScreen specified list. If you expand that out, you'll see all the different lists that the chemical shows up on and the associated list translator scores, and you'll see that it has a hazard summary table. In this case, there are blanks, which are different than data gaps. It just means that you don't know what the hazard level is because it's not showing up on those lists. Next slide. And finally, I just wanted to give a high-level overview, and you can click through all of these, of some standard scorecards and eco-labels that have integrated GreenScreen as the hazard assessment methodology or approach, primarily in the electronics sector with TCO certified and EPEAT, textile sector, and furniture and fabric with ZDHC and level, and then the building sector, the most notable one being the U.S. Green Building Council. Next slide. And this is just a high level of some companies that have adopted GreenScreen. And I'm keeping this brief because you get to hear from the actual users themselves, starting with a regulatory body that uses GreenScreen. So I think this is my last slide. Go ahead, next slide. Yes, so here's my contact information if you have questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian from the Washington State Department of Ecology to talk to us about the use of GreenScreen in government.
Great, thank you, Sherry. That was a good job. Again, I do work for the State Department of Ecology. We were actually founded in 1970, and that's 10 months before the US EPA. So we're the first governmental agency in the US devoted to environmental protection. Sherry and I both live in Washington State. That's under the red star there at the upper left of the map. So next slide, I want to spend a little time talking about how we've used GreenScreen to promote safer substitution. In the late 90s, Washington and a number of other states were frustrated that I'm sorry, just back one slide. Washington and a number of other states were frustrated that the slow pace of regulation at the federal level. And we recognized that we needed to take action on our own to protect the public from hazardous chemicals and products. And it was recognized quite early that you couldn't simply ban chemicals. You also had to do work on investigating substitutes and promoting safer alternatives if you wanted to protect the public and make change. Given that the EU and other states had already banned chemicals like penta and Deca-BDE, the flame retardants, it was what we call a no-brainer for us to pass similar laws. But we were the first government body to ban Deca-BDE in applications of mattress flame retardants. There was still some uncertainty about applications of Deca, however, in upholstered furniture and in televisions and computers, electronics enclosures. And our state legislature, in their wisdom, established a ban of Deca-BDE in those products. But the ban was contingent on our identifying safer, effective, and affordable alternatives. So this was quite a big challenge, as we were used to dealing with toxicity data and talking about the fate of chemicals in the environment. But taking on this broader range of criteria is a daunting challenge, as many of you know. So next slide. The early laws and work on banning penta and octa are filled with tables of toxicology data. We love to talk about low ALs and no ALs and reference doses and benchmark doses for all sorts of effects. And it's an enormous task to make sense of this kind of data, especially when it comes from varied sources. It's difficult also to explain this data to laypersons like legislators and the general public. And this is also the famous multi-criteria decision problem. If you want to rank a chemical as being safer or less safe, there are many paths that you can take. And coincidentally, as we did this work on the flame retardants, the Clean Production Action was presenting the GreenScreen as a new tool, and they focused on these flame retardants in electronic enclosures. And Ecology cited that work in our own reports, and I guess you could say that that was the start of a beautiful relationship. And CPA has been a partner with us in advancing hazard assessment tools and also in teaching people and companies how to use them. That's very important. Now, Sherry has already highlighted the advantages for communicating hazards across the supply chain. The fact is, it's easy to come up with a ranking system, and there are many of them out there. But what we especially value about the GreenScreen, it is that it's a living and evolving system. So as the science of toxicology and assessment advances, Clean Production Action has continued to improve the methodology and to keep it up to date. And also, very important, they have developed an ecosystem of training and supporting organizations around the GreenScreen that allow them to play in the big league. Next slide. Now, if you're going to identify safer substitutes, you have to go well beyond comparing hazards. And it became clear that we needed a framework or a set of guidelines. It keeps jumping forward. I'm not sure why. We needed a framework in order to help us settle on a process to address the other elements of alternatives assessment: performance, cost, and exposure. My predecessor here at Ecology, Alex Stone, was instrumental in coordinating efforts among a number of states to develop a collective approach. The result of this was the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse, we also call it IC2, Guide to Alternatives Assessment. It was published in 2014. And I want to talk to you about some examples of our using this process along with GreenScreen in the substitution problem. Next slide. So again, the IC2 methodology has been updated to version 1.1 that was published in 2017. And Washington State has developed a somewhat simpler guide. It's based on the IC2 guide and primarily directed at small and medium enterprises. But both guides recognize and recommend the use of the GreenScreen assessment for the hazard module in an alternatives assessment process. And I think you can take this as a vote of confidence from the various state, county, and city members that participated with us in the development of these guides. Next slide. So you know that this work of alternative assessment is not easy. For one thing, in our first use of this guide, we were addressing alternatives to copper anti-fouling paint. This work was completed in 2017 by an NGO in our area, Northwest Green Chemistry, funded by Ecology. This is a problem that's of interest in Europe too, I know, and some of this work was reported last year in the Netherlands. Paints are formulated products, and as such, they can have many ingredients. So it can take a lot of resources to assess all of these chemicals. What we've been able to do is use the GreenScreen system of tools to prioritize ingredients for assessment. So we can quickly and easily apply the GreenScreen List Translator, identify chemicals that are of high concern, and perhaps avoid a deeper assessment. In this study, we chose to evaluate all the biocides using the GreenScreen full assessment and other selective substances. I have an example on the bottom left there for two of the most common biocides, copper oxide and zinc pyrithione. Now, both of these are benchmark 1 chemicals that we would recommend that you avoid. And this is also an example in the case of zinc pyrithione, where while that compound itself is not persistent, it degrades into zinc in the environment, which is persistent. And so the benchmark 1 has that little TP transformation product subscript. You can find the full assessment results at the Northwest Green Chemistry website at the link provided on the slide. Next slide. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds. Sherry has shown you a bit about how GreenScreen is done. If you're going to be a regular user of GreenScreen data, I would suggest that you get some training from Clean Production Action. As Sherry mentioned, I'm an authorized GreenScreen practitioner, which means that I can prepare assessments for Ecology. Generally, we find that it's most cost-effective to use one of the third-party licensed profilers that Sherry mentioned. They're better, faster, and cheaper at producing green screens than me. But it is good to have someone around who understands the system well. So for example, after we completed our assessment of anti-fouling paints, the RAC adopted a new opinion for harmonized classification for zinc pyrithione. It's now classified for reproductive toxicity as category 1B. And because of my experience with the GreenScreen system, I know that that's going to make a significant change in the GreenScreen profile for zinc pyrithione. It was previously considered a low level of concern for reproductive toxicity. This would convert it to high. Now, this is not a do-it-yourself operation. I can't just put a high red box in there. We would ask a profiler to update the assessment formally and to review the background data. But we don't have to wait for the official journal to publish the results. We can take these results, understand the impact on our ranking system in the GreenScreen, and move forward. Since we're a government agency, the public has a right to know how we make our decisions. And if we use the GreenScreen assessment, we really need to share that data openly with the public. So Washington is working with other states to publish GreenScreens as a free resource in a database at the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse. This slide shot here is a little out of date. There are currently, I think, about 110 GreenScreen assessments at the IC2 database. In the beginning, there was a lot of attention on developing GreenScreens for so-called bad actors. We wanted to be able to explain why they were bad and just exactly how bad they were. But our focus has changed in recent years. We pretty much know what's bad. What our partners in the business community need is reliable information on what are safer alternatives. So we've begun to commission assessments for chemicals that we believe fit in that group of potential safer alternatives. We've just commissioned 6 new assessments, and we'll be publishing those on the IC2 database in the next month or so. So next slide. We also use GreenScreen for both internal and external trainings. In Washington, we have about a dozen toxics reduction staff located around the state. They're not compliance officers. They're not looking for violations. Their job is to provide free technical assistance, mostly to our larger hazardous waste generators. All of these staff are trained in using the GreenScreen system tools and get some experience in using things like the list translator in exercises and training that we've developed here and in partnership with Clean Production Action. We also offer these trainings on a periodic basis to businesses at low cost. And we invite our toxics reduction staff to come to these trainings where they can make connections with businesses that are wanting to make change. And I'm proud to say that these tools are also filtering down to our city and county level technical assistance staff. On the lower right, I have a draft there of a fact sheet that one of our local agencies is putting out on identifying chemicals of concern in automotive parts cleaners, and they're using a combination there of list translator data and GreenScreen benchmark scores. So there are still hundreds of these small businesses, auto body shops, that continue to use hazardous substances when we know there are better alternatives available. Next slide. So I just want to say that while we're a small state, we're taking very concrete steps to implementing safer chemical solutions. And GreenScreen has been an important component to facilitating the conversation on chemical hazards. And we couldn't have done this work without the help of our partners, which I've identified here on the slide. So thank you very much. It's great to have the opportunity to speak with you. And I'll pass it now to Corey Robertson from HP.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brian. Yes, I agree. It's been great to prepare this presentation with this panel, and appreciate the opportunity to share this with this group. So next slide. I've been asked to kind of talk about, how, why, and a little bit of the history of, HP's use of the GreenScreen. So I'll start out with the why. So HP, as some of you may be aware, has a kind of a long history of corporate social responsibility, starting with our founders, Bill and Dave. And it's carried on through the years, and there's a lot of visibility, and our CEO talks about sustainability in most of his company addresses and things like that. So there's kind of a company culture of sustainability practices, if you will. And so, that's kind of ingrained in our culture, and you can see HP's vision is to create technology that makes life better for everyone everywhere. And so, that pulls into it, things like conflict minerals, worker safety, up and down the supply chain. And then one of the things we've been talking about more recently is sustainable impact, which is, HP can be sustainable, but how do we enable our customers to increase their, sustainability, if you will? So that's kind of where our focus has been. And so how do we get there in the material space? That's just what we're talking about here. How do we use materials that are better and more sustainable, right? So one way is following regulations, right? That's pretty easy. You don't need someone like me to be involved if you're going to do that. That's more about compliance assurance and testing and those sorts of things. So that's not simple to do, but simple to understand. But then there's other ways that we can reach that through strategic substitutions, like a phthalate example, which I'll go through here in a minute. Some voluntary initiatives like low halogen is big in the electronics industry. The zero discharge of hazardous chemicals is in the apparel industry, but it's something that we, kind of look to as a model, I guess, of how we could do this sort of thing. And then eco labels are a big, kind of important part of that. So I'll go through that as well. Next slide. So just a little bit of the history of how HP got involved with the GreenScreen. So we were involved in this EPA Design for Environment partnership program. The first one was the flame retardants and printed circuit boards, and then later was the Deca-BDE, which Brian kind of mentioned a little bit about. That came about. So we were involved, certainly in the printed circuit board discussion. And what came out of that work in that report was this hazard table that Sherry had kind of mentioned in the GreenScreen work. But we recognized that there was a lot of value in the data that kind of went into generating this table, but it's a little bit hard to kind of understand how to apply that, right, in a business sense. And in talking with Lauren Hine and Mark Rossi, the developers of the original GreenScreen document, I think they talked about, well, maybe we could count the number of lows or count the mediums and highs and come up with a score that way. But that wasn't really the answer. But they did come up with, obviously, what we felt was kind of the best answer, the GreenScreen. So you could go ahead and click through. I think there's some pop-up things that will come in here. But yeah, there's just a lot of data that kind of goes into this hazard table, but it's not as usable in a business sense as we'd like it to be. So if you go to the next slide, and I won't go back through all the nuances of how you get a GreenScreen score, but the important thing is that it's a simple and easy to understand score. 1 through 4, anyone can understand it, but there's a lot of expert knowledge and that goes into generating. Toxicologists put this together. As Sherry mentioned, I am an authorized practitioner myself. I don't do a lot of assessments anymore. Occasionally we do, but we rely on third-party assessments through the licensed profilers. And so, Brian had mentioned the training that was available, and that's kind of a key part of this, the whole GreenScreen network, I guess, is all of the training and background that goes into generating those scores is top notch, right? And so we can't necessarily do that in house, but we can certainly use these GreenScreen scores, which are easy to understand, and not just someone with some technical knowledge, but even in people in procurement, can look at that number and kind of understand. Okay, we know what benchmark 1 means. Okay, next slide. And go ahead and click through these pop-ups here. Yeah, thanks. So since it's coming from, it came from the US EPA Design for Environment program, which is now the Safer Choice program, and other thoughts out there in how to regulate or use safer materials. This kind of approach is become the norm, I guess. So it aligns with what the regulators are thinking and doing. Certainly with Washington State and California Safer Consumer Products regulations, it's right in that wheelhouse there. So the important part for us is that it normalizes stakeholder inputs, right? So you can imagine that, for some people, carcinogenicity is the number one issue, right? Or some people, aquatic toxicity is their number one issue, or certainly endocrine disruption is the number one issue, right? And so we get all of those inputs, right? And, we need some way to understand, which ones, really are more important, and how do we go about, making those value judgments. And I'll have a slide on that towards the end as well. But probably most importantly, go back one, sorry. Most importantly, it's a green chemistry approach, and I won't go into depth in what green chemistry is. I assume most of the people on here will know what that means, but risk is a function of hazard and exposure, and the green chemistry approach is right to reduce the hazard, right? And we at HP recognize that that's definitely what we want to do, right? We don't want to, and a lot of times we don't control how people may be exposed to their products. They may want to chew on a power cord or something, right? And we can't necessarily control that, but what we can have more control of is reducing the hazard. Reduce those materials that are in our product to be the substances or the materials that no one cares about, right? It's kind of one of the things that we strive to do. We want to reduce the hazardous substances in our products as much as possible. All right, next slide, thanks. Okay, so you can click through all the transitions here. But this is that phthalate example that I talked about. So strategic substitution, right? So you can imagine that there's a lot of churn, and that results in costs of changing from one material to another in our supply chain, right? So HP doesn't manufacture anything. We have suppliers that do everything for us, and if we ask for different materials in a product, if it's not industry standard, we get charged more for that. It also just disrupts the supply chain, and so there's costs associated with that. So this is a slide that we like to show, like our managers of this is why we want to do the green screen. This is why we want to use less hazardous materials. Because if we, go from one phthalate to another, it's going to cost us more than if we identify the best alternative, or a few good alternatives that we can point suppliers to. We can make that transition once and only incur those transition costs once. Okay, next slide. Another way that we use the green screen is kind of this whitelist approach. So we have these, we call them procurement guidance documents. We have them for flame retardants and for plasticizers, and it's basically just a kind of a, we don't talk about the green screen score necessarily in this, but we put materials in groups, basically based on their green screen score. And so this kind of gives something that we can give our suppliers and our procurement people to say, if someone is asking about a substance that they want to use, you can look it up in here, and we have some guidance on, whether or not that's a good alternative, right? And so obviously we want to avoid anything that's in the do not use category. And, for the most part, anything above, which would be a benchmark 2, the use but search for alternatives is acceptable. And we mostly just want to move away from the benchmark 1s, but hopefully we get to the point where we're starting to differentiate between benchmark 2s and 3s and using those more and more, which we've seen a little bit of that. Okay, next slide. And another way that we use it is just in material selection data. So sometimes we have these material options that we present to our product engineers, as they're selecting materials. And sometimes that's passed along to our suppliers and that sort of thing. And a lot of times it's based on, does it meet EPEAT? Does it meet TCO? Does it have a certain amount of recycled content, right? And so along with all that data, we can add in the GreenScreen scores, right? So that they can get some idea, okay, this one has benchmark 2 substances, so we're pretty good, or this one has benchmark 1 substance, maybe it's not regulated at this time, but we'll probably run into problems down the road. So better to select one of the other options in the table. So that's proven to be pretty effective as well. Okay, next slide. So eco labels. This is an important. I put this slide in. This is from our corporate report, right, of kind of how important eco labels are to HP, right? So you can see that probably the biggest one is Energy Star, right? You can see that most of our products meet Energy Star, more than 80%. But TCO is one that's recognizable in Europe for sure, and EPEAT are also very important eco labels for us. And there's a lot of reasons that eco labels are important, but it allows us to make the business case to our businesses that in order to meet EPEAT Gold or to meet the TCO standard, we need to do these certain things. And so we can work with TCO and EPEAT to kind of design those standards to promote the low hazard alternatives. And so we've kind of taken that approach in the last few years. So next slide. Yeah, so we worked pretty closely with TCO to kind of come up with this, this incorporating the GreenScreen into TCO. And you can see the requirement there is GreenScreen benchmark 2, 3, or 4 for plasticizers, and they also have flame retardants that are used in certain plastic parts, right, of a certain weight or something like that, right? And so so this directly involves the GreenScreen in that eco label. And then next slide. Kind of similarly for EPEAT, we did a lot of work in promoting using the GreenScreen as the alternative assessment tool of choice in EPEAT. And you can see similarly, flame retardants and plasticizers and plastic parts greater than 25 grams, you get optional points for using benchmark 3 or 4. You get 2 points. If you use the benchmark 2s as well, you only get 1 point. Kind of thing. So it kind of allows a way to differentiate between those. Yeah, and then if you go to the next slide, I think that this might be my last slide, and I'll just kind of leave it here. But it's just kind of bringing home that point of value judgment. So in developing the EP criteria, there was a lot of input, right, of other methods. As Brian said, there's lots of ways to make tools that come up with a score. Or something, but what's behind that kind of thing. And so one of the main questions that we discussed a lot was so the GreenScreen is just based on GHS hazard classifications. Why can't we just use GHS instead of GreenScreen or something, right? And so it really comes down to this value judgment. So what do those scores mean? How do those scores relate to another? How do we take a comprehensive look at this substance? And so the example I give here is how do you choose which is better between a category 2 carcinogen or a category 1 chronic aquatic and category 2 eye irritant or something, right? How do you kind of make those decisions? And that's kind of where the GreenScreen comes in and fills that critical I think role of translating those hazard tables into something that we can incorporate into our business practices. So that's it for me. I appreciate the time, and there's my contact information, and I'll turn it over to Paul.
Thank you very much, Corey. And thank you for the opportunity to be contributing here on this particular webinar. And you'll tell from the accent that I'm actually from a European base here in the UK, but I should say that the Anthesis group is active on both sides of the Atlantic, throughout Europe and also in several locations in the US. And from a chemical management evaluation, we've been looking at the emergence and the adoption of GreenScreen with some interest, because we have been involved quite extensively in the development and implementation of REACH in Europe. We see its strengths and its potential weaknesses. Equally, we've been looking at a less regulated environment in the US in terms of, at least at federal level, and seeing how GreenScreen has been bringing together, I think, some common thinking, as Brian mentioned earlier on, in the context of the interstate work and other factors which are pulling together, I think, from a GreenScreen perspective. So I'd like to spend a little time. I'm very conscious that this audience probably doesn't need too much education on REACH, and certainly I don't want to turn this into a REACH discussion. But my objective in these few minutes is just to make a comparison, a compare and contrast really between what REACH delivers and what GreenScreen delivers. I personally believe that they're not competitive with one another. I think they're very much complementary to one another, and I'll try and explain in the next few minutes why I think that is the case. So if I could go to the next slide, please. This is not intended to be an eyesight test. It's really fundamentally just identifying that the requirements, the minimum data set effectively for REACH is a significant one. This is the registration data requirements, and if you just go to the next reveal, we can see that we cover 3 areas of data requirement from registrants. One is in the physicochemical area, the second is in the ecotox, and the third is in the human health toxicology elements. If you go to the next reveal as well, please. And you see that the minimum data set depends on the tonnage band, which can be from 1 to 10 tons through to greater than 1,000 tons, and that's measured on an annual basis for an individual registrant. And that drives the amount of data that needs to be submitted. And the data is split into 4 columns there, which is Annex 7 to Annex 10 tests. So if you just carry on with those reveals, there should be 5 bullets on the right-hand side when you're through. I think the pattern is very similar to the one we've seen for GreenScreen. REACH requires and follows really the primary GHS endpoints, 18 of them. And in fairness, as it's a data generation and data submission exercise for the registrants under REACH for any particular chemical, that does provide considerable input to the GreenScreen assessments. And it's often the case that GreenScreen profilers are actively assessing what data is available through the REACH process. And so you see automatically there's an interlinkage between the 2 initiatives in that way. It also gives an early insight into data gaps at the substance level, because REACH is very much a systematic approach. It does, I think, highlight quickly where the data gaps are, and certainly encourages the fulfilling of them in certainly the Annex 7 and Annex 8 requirements, and we'll come on to that on the next slide. But it also allows ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, to consider the next steps in terms of data needs. So if you move to the next slide, please. And again, just reveal through. So the first point I want to make here is that the initial registrations are only required at Annex 7 and Annex 8 data sets, although if you do have, or if companies do have pre-existing Annex 9 and Annex 10 data, that can be included in the initial dossier. However, one of the goals of REACH, and certainly one of the reasons why companies are asked to collaborate with one another through what's called a SIF, Substance Information Exchange Forum, which is normally focused around a consortium. The reason for that is to avoid unnecessary animal testing. In other words, avoiding companies in parallel running off to do additional studies. So there's a collaboration model there which indeed helps to fill data gaps in, particularly in Annex 9 and 10. But they're all set out in a test plan which is submitted to ECHA and which ECHA needs to approve before it's commenced. So in other words, no further animal testing takes place until ECHA has approved that test plan. And it can be selective. It doesn't necessarily require all data points to be filled at all times, because there may be relevance to particular relevance to a study and a mode of action, which would be the focus of any test design. And so therefore you tend to find that those data or test plan selection processes are hopefully targeted. We then see in some cases that the data is sufficient already to develop some form of a harmonized approach to classification amongst the registrants, and that's not a formal process at that stage, but there is at least a comparison between registrants about classification approaches based on the data available. And then, assuming that the substance has further interest, in other words, there are some hazard profiles which are of relevance to the member state competent authorities, which tend to be the decision makers ultimately amongst the breach process, then there can be triggered a substance evaluation, which takes the data which is submitted through both the original registration and the test plan and takes it forward into a full evaluation. And those are identified by each of the member states according to their interests and are included on something called the CORAP, which is the Community Rolling Action Plan. So next slide, please. So I just want to compare side by side here what I see to be the advantages and disadvantages of both processes. We're looking at evaluation, basically substance evaluation in each case. And if you just stop there for a moment. And I think the clarity about substance evaluation is clearly is a regulatory process. It's a very formalized process and needs not only to have a member state actually leading it as a rapporteur, but also needs to have regular meetings within the other member states to actually agree on ways forward. So although one member state takes the lead, there is a consultative process that runs between the member states and ECHA coordinates. Now that is a pretty prescribed process, and it leads to a series of member state committee conclusions or more likely decisions, and then the actions are passed back to the registrants to respond in a timely manner. But each evaluation step and each therefore feedback to the registrants to take further action, for instance to close further data gaps, takes probably a cycle of somewhere between 2 and 3 years, because each member state has 1 year to do the initial substance evaluation and then feeds back to the registrants to take their actions, which maybe take 1 to 2 years. And it should be said that the primary purpose of the substance evaluation is to derive a set of risk management measures for continued safe use of the substance. So in other words, the substance evaluation here is a risk-driven evaluation ultimately. It's to decide how to continue to use a substance rather than how to necessarily replace it. And it's only if the risk management measures move into the area of either authorization or restriction that you might then look into a formal substitution approach. However, the other thing to mention too is that the only exceptionally is a substance identified for listing as a substance of very high concern. You'll notice that the list of SVHCs is a relatively short. And that's because the hurdle to go through to reach that point is quite significant and probably quite lengthy as well. So we would typically think about a 5-year process probably to get from the beginnings of a substance evaluation to probably an SVHC listing if it goes through that route. However, there are opportunities for member states to actually leapfrog that process, and any member state can submit what's known as an Annex 15 dossier at any time if they believe that there is already sufficient evidence to list a chemical as a substance of very high concern. So the reason I've set out so much on REACH is I then wanted to compare with GreenScreen, where GreenScreen assessments fit here. And I think the first thing to say is that GreenScreen works with the data it has, and therefore it is a much more rapid process, and allows for hazard profiling at any point in time. So in other words, you don't have to wait until the end to actually make an assessment. The data gaps are recognized, as we've heard from the other presenters, and where assessments cannot be conclusive, there is recognition of possible issues rather than definite issues. And the key difference, in my view, between REACH regulatory outputs, for instance, a substance evaluation report, and GreenScreen is the basic simplicity of the GreenScreen outputs. Being able to essentially assign a benchmark in 1, 2, 3, or 4 makes it a potentially communicable set of information along a supply chain. And that's much different to passing a substance evaluation report along a supply chain, which is really quite difficult to reach conclusions on. I think the other thing to mention about GreenScreen, which I think is particularly relevant in the European context, is that there is regular review because of GreenScreens, because there is time-limited validity on any GreenScreen assessment. And that allows for the updating of an assessment based on any additional data from REACH or from elsewhere. And so you don't have to wait until you have all the data. You can make an evaluation knowing that it will be updated in due course, depending on the emergence of new data. And of course, you don't have to wait to the expiration of one if you believe that new data really changes the scenario. So for those stakeholders recognizing GreenScreen assessments, and obviously we've just heard from HP as one of those, they provide also a consistent approach across various jurisdictions. So the GreenScreen benchmark is not going to change between the US and North America generally and Europe. And so therefore it is a international language of discussion, which is super important when it comes to supply chains. So if you just go with the final reveal on this slide, I'd just like to make the comment that essentially the conclusion that I've drawn from this is that substance evaluations and GreenScreen assessments are complementary rather than competitive. They potentially serve different, although working from the same data, they serve different purposes and obviously have different benefits to them. The main advantage with GreenScreen is the speed and the versatility and the ease of communication along the supply chain. So if we go to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to this is my final slide. I just wanted to mention a few thoughts in conclusion from that assessment. And the first is that we've looked at GreenScreen, as I mentioned, from a European perspective to a degree, but also from a North American perspective. And we see, as we see the methods that are out there, GreenScreen probably represents one of the most robust methodologies. And it's based on a common data set, as we would also use in REACH. And it therefore, in our view, can be used to provide a reliable hazard profile during the REACH process, which, as I said, saves you having to wait till the end of that process. And whereas the risk management measures arising out of substance evaluations will take time to emerge and be applied under a regulatory framework, GreenScreen can be used to compare alternatives at an earlier stage. And a little bit in the way that I think both Brian and Corey referred to during their presentations, the value also of GreenScreen is that you are likely to be incentivized to look at actually chemicals of less concern, in other words, potential alternatives at an earlier stage as well. So the simplicity of the GreenScreen benchmarking system allows for easier hazard comparisons when doing that, and also is able to be conveyed along a supply chain with reasonable confidence. I have a sense from our role, which often is in terms of managing REACH consortia, in terms of generating data and helping with the substance evaluations that proceed on different chemicals, that there could be a value in existing REACH consortia thinking about actually carrying out a GreenScreen assessment in parallel with any work that they're formally doing under the substance evaluation process. Not that it will obviously supplant the REACH process, but that it will actually act as an adjunct to it, and one which might be more communicable along the supply chain. So I think the other point to mention is it must be recognized that GreenScreen is primarily a hazard assessment tool, but exposure parameters may still be relevant. And therefore, whilst GreenScreen, I think along the green chemistry principles that have been discussed earlier on, are very much about hazard reduction, and I am absolutely an advocate that the simplest way to reduce risk is to remove hazard. But equally, there will be those applications where exposure may be extremely limited for whatever reason, and that does need to be considered when you're considering multifaceted substitution strategies.
Thank you to all of our speakers. For more information about GreenScreen, you can visit their official website. Remember to take a look at our substitution web pages for information on tools, methodologies, events, and networks, as well as matchmaking sites for searchers and alternative providers. There, you can find information on how ECHA processes the substance data it collects, and how you can use it to find out their regulatory status, their hazards, and their uses. We will now open the Q&A session. If your question is not answered through the Q&A panel by the time the webinar closes at 18:15 Helsinki time, send it to us using our contact form. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. A link to the recording and presentations will be sent to you in the coming days. See you again in one of our upcoming events.